Hey guys, it's me, obviously. You know my face. We're going to talk about conditioning. And I don't have a lot of practice at sort of podcasting for classes. You'll bear with me while we navigate the technology. All right. So today, conditioning. And the very first thing we need to do is talk about what is behavior. No, the very first thing is to talk about what is learning. The name of the chapter, unfortunately, is learning, and we're going to do um, precious little about actually learning today. Conditioning is the order of the day. What I'm trying to do right now while I'm talking is share the document. You have this. It's on your D2L shell already, and here we go. There we are. I'm really not going to talk about much that's not in this document, and that's it. You already have it. It's in the announcements page. Might have to scroll a little to get it at this point, but it's in there. Okay, so learning through association, that's what conditioning means. And how do we get a whole chapter in the book that's about classical and operant conditioning, but that is called learning? And the answer to that is politics. Remember, from the outset of class, we've said that everything ultimately is political. If there's two people in a room and one wants something different from the other and they're having a conversation about it, that's politics, right? Well, this particular form of politics also involves power structures. So remember, we have the Dark Ages or the medieval period, and all knowledge that's retained is retained in churches. And after this succession of plagues is rolled through Europe, each wiping out a third of humanity, too soon? Too soon to talk about that? Um, After that period, and we have a resurgence of agrarianism, and then people are fed. We can do more than just struggle in the dirt for worms to eat and stuff like that. Finally, we're ready for knowledge again. That knowledge comes back out of churches, right? And that knowledge comes out in church Latin and Greek. So um, as we start doing science, science is done in the 17 and 1800s. It's done in Greek and Latin, right? So that's why all your medical textbooks and terminology are Greek and Latin. There's no reason to call this bone the humerus. We could call it the upper arm bone. It's just that that's what happened after the Dark Ages, and we get the sort of re-enlightenment period, if you like. Science is done that way. Okay. Um, Good. So lots of stuff is about battles that we had and political battles that we had a long time ago. When we're talking classical conditioning, we're going to see that the early behaviorists came up with language exactly in the model that medicine uses to sort of keep the riffraff out of the field, right? So you're going to have to learn some terminology, and it's going to sound complicated because it's in a specialized language. But I'm going to sort of give you ways to cheat around the edges of that, because honestly, it's not that complicated when you do away with the obfuscating language. All right. So here we are, early 1920s, and knowledge is power structures, right? Science involves power structures. It involves Greek and Latin, so that only the right kind of people can practice the science. Um, Now, behaviorism is in the midst of fighting this battle with Freudian analysis. Here's another power structure, right? Medicine has emerged back onto the scene as a power structure, as a way to get and keep power and build empires. And the early behaviorists, in order to be a psychologist, you had to license as a physician, right? So you had to go through medical school and do your internships, and then when you were done with that, you had to sign up for some Freudian analysis and get trained in Freudian psychology and psychiatry, and then you'd license as an MD psychiatrist after another 4 to 8 years of education and training after that, and you'd always have to like keep showing up for your analysis and make sure that you're um, that you're in good psychiatric shape, you know. So you'd always sort of owe allegiance to your psychoanalytic ancestry and so on. So the early behaviorists, you know, they're campaigning to get rid of this and let us just be psychologists. They're really resentful of the sort of castles that the Freudians built in the sky, you know. Remember, those guys were doing natural philosophy, not necessarily psychology, and certainly not science. Yeah. So in natural philosophy, what you do is you have an idea, and it seems to explain something in the environment, but then you get married to that idea and you're willing to die for it forever. So you get all these weird ideas about ids and egos and super egos and subconscious or unconscious processes that no one can track or check into, and then Freudian slips, and where you say one thing but mean your mother, and women have penis envy, and everyone's worried about sex. No one's worried about dying. They're all worried about sex all the time, and because you don't know you're worried about sex, your life gets really messy and you have anxieties. You're set in stone by age 5 based on your relationships with your mother. And the behaviorists, no, we can't study any of this stuff, right? We can't even come up with an experiment where we could attempt to refute the statements made by the Freudians, and that's not science. That's not science. What's happening in the 1920s? Physics, chemistry, not only the discovery, but the deconstruction of atoms down to their deeper structures. Chemistry, you can, if you have two compounds and you put them together in the right conditions, you have repeatable experiments, right? The right proportions of oxygen and hydrogen and temperature, and they're going to combine into water, and that's going to happen every time you do it under those conditions. That's what the behaviorists want. They want predictability. They want empiricism. Okay. So the first behaviorists were not only strict behaviorists, but radical behaviorists. By the time we get to B.F. Skinner in the 1940s, he's not just saying this is a good and productive way to do science. He's saying this is the only way to do psychology. So if you're practicing as a humanist or a Freudian, you're not just wrong, but unethical. And they want everyone but themselves to be defrocked, which means stripped of their license to practice psychology. That's the setting that we're getting into. That's what we're getting into right now. When we have a whole chapter in the textbook that's called learning, but is only about behaviorism, that's a political victory, right? That's a power structure built on the part of the early behaviorists. They've won that. They've won that round. Let's, if I can figure out how to do it, let's dive back into the document here. Here we go. There we are. All right. So that's part one. Part one, how do we get to a thing where it's called learning, but is actually just about conditioning? Well, that's political victories right at the beginning. And that has everything to do with the battles that they were fighting early in the history of psychology. Like, is psychology its own thing? And if it is, who's going to benefit from it? And so they're saying it is going to be its own thing, and we're going to be the only way to practice psychology. Freudians are out. Okay. So here's this next question. What is behavior? Oh my goodness, here. So a behaviorist definition of behavior might not necessarily be what we think of as behavior. Like, is blinking a behavior? Is sweating a behavior? Is passing gas a behavior? All right. And the behaviorist is going to say absolutely. Why? Because all of these things are observable and they are measurable. And if you can observe it and you can measure it, and an organism's doing it, then it's a behavior. Now it's going to rule in a bunch of stuff that you're uncomfortable with, like sweating. But look, sweating, I can weigh a set of clothing. right? Find out how much does it weigh. And then I'm going to put that on your body. Then I'm going to have you do some activity, maybe exercise, maybe not exercise. Maybe I'm going to expose you to anxiety provoking stimuli. And then we're going to take those clothes back off and we're going to weigh them. And the difference in weight between T1 and T2 is sweat, right? You sweat it into your clothing. So I can observe it, I can see it happening, I can measure it, how much is it happening? That's a behavior. What makes you uncomfortable probably is the idea of volition, okay? So now we're gonna break behavior down into two separate classes, which you absolutely didn't need before this lecture, right? There's volitional behavior and non-volitional behavior. Volitional behaviors are things that you do intentionally. They're under your control, and they almost always, for our purposes, always are directed at a goal, right? You do a behavior in order to achieve something in the environment. So another way to say that is operant and non-operant behaviors, right? So operant behaviors are those intentional, volitional behaviors, and then the non-operant behaviors are the reflexive or impulsive behaviors, which is like blinking. It's not necessarily something you're doing on purpose. Sweating, you're certainly not sweating on purpose. Breathing, okay? And of course, those definitions are a little bit sloppy. As we always learn in these classes, the lines between things are never quite as clear and bright as we would like them to be. So breathing, you can bring breathing at least temporarily under your control, correct? Go ahead right now, take a deep breath and hold it for a second. Cool, you did that volitionally. You shifted control of breathing from your brain stem into your frontal lobes and you held it for a second. But can you hold your breath until you die? No, of course not. Eventually, the brain stem is going to reassert control over breathing and save your life, right? So you could bring blinking under your temporary conscious control. You could blink out in Morse code the word torture, right? So that when you've been captured in war and you're forced to give sort of propaganda statements on video, you can, while you're speaking the words you're told to speak, you can also blink out this code that says that those words were coerced from you. All right, cool. But for our purposes, right, when it's happening non-volitionally, when it's happening automatically, even though you could assert control over it, it is a non-volitional or non-operant behavior. All right. So the next thing is we need to get into the kinds of conditioning. There's two kinds of behavior, operant or non-operant. Also, you could call those volitional or non-volitional. And we have two kinds of conditioning, which each operate on a different kind of behavior, all right? So classical behavior operates on those non-operant behaviors. And operant conditioning works to modify those operant behaviors, right? Operant works on operant, classical works on non-operant. And today for this lecture, we're just going to deal with this first one. We're going to deal with classical conditioning. So here's your definition of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning pairs two stimuli such that one comes to stand for the other as evidenced by a non-operant behavior. Now that sounds like nonsense to you. That sounds like just babbling. Maybe you know all the words, they don't make any sense. But as we run through this, they're going to start to make a lot of sense to you. So if we were in a classroom right now, I'd ask anyone if they knew about Pavlov's dogs, and then I'd sip tea and wait. But there's no point in doing that because I'm not in a classroom and neither are you. So I'll just tell you about Pavlov's dogs. Okay, you're welcome. So Pavlov was a biologist. He was not a psychologist. He didn't own the dogs for the purposes of psychological experiments. They're going to expose them to various compounds and then euthanize them and vivisect them and examine their anatomy. That was the purpose of the dogs. But it's like 1912 in Russia or whatever, wherever, whenever. And Pavlov has these dogs for medical research purposes, but he starts to notice that when he comes into the kennels, the dogs mostly ignore him, unless he comes into the kennels at around 5 o'clock, which is feeding time, right? So when he comes in the kennels at 5 o'clock, the dogs go crazy, and he noticed they're salivating and dripping saliva and barking and coming close to the gates and whatever. And so he feeds them, but he goes away thinking about this. Like, hang on a second, maybe dogs have some rudimentary consciousness that's capable of retaining information, right? He's not thinking about how they feel. But he is thinking about whether you could modify this non-operant behavior, this reflexive behavior of salivation. So, what are the conditions that are causing the dogs to salivate when it's both 5 o'clock and I come into the space, right? So he sets up this experiment. Is salivating a behavior? Well, for the behaviorist, yes, because why? You can observe it and you can measure it. Okay. So all we need is like some little plastic baggies and duct tape. Yeah. So what we're going to do is we need a baseline measurement of how much do dogs salivate, right? So I'm going to take my little baggies and I'm going to duct tape them under the dog's jowls or whatever, and I'm going to start the timer. Maybe it's 2 minutes, and I'm going to see what is the weight of the bag before and after the 2 minutes have elapsed, right? After 2 minutes, take it off, put it on my little scale. The difference in grams is the weight of the saliva. That's how much dogs salivate in 2 minutes. Cool? All right, good. The next thing I need is a baseline of dogs salivating in response to the presentation of food. So he's going to present them with meat powder. Why meat powder? Because it's Russia in like 1912. They don't have meat for people, never mind meat for dogs in laboratories. So the food stimulus is meat powder, and he waves it in front of the dogs, right? Shove those baggies under their jowls, right? Way before and after 2 minutes. And that's how much dogs salivate when they're presented with food, which of course is much higher than they salivate. It's just 3 in the afternoon and nothing's happening, right? Okay, cool. And then we're going to ring a bell. Everyone's heard about the bell. In fact, it's a tuning fork. The tuning fork might be important later because we want to get into the ability of the dogs to discriminate between stimuli, right? Can a dog tell the difference between C and F sharp, whatever, like that? Turns out they can. Maybe not important right now, so we're just going to say it was a bell for the sake of simplicity. So we're going to duct tape that baggie up under there, and then we're going to ring a bell and collect 2 minutes of saliva. And it turns out that that spit bag weighs exactly the same as the very first spit bag, which is dogs salivating in response to no stimuli at all. All right? Good. Next part of the experiment, we can move into the experimental phase. We have our baselines. We are going to ring the bell, present the meat powder, and then weigh the spit bag. And then tomorrow, we're going to ring the bell, present the food, weigh the spit bag. Bell, food, saliva, bell, food, saliva, bell, food, saliva, bell, food, saliva. And then after a sort of random number of repetitions, we're going to ring the bell and not present the food and then weigh the saliva. All right. And what you find is that the dogs salivate to the presentation of the bell as though we had presented the food, even though we hadn't presented the food. So let's open this thing back up. I'm just taking it on faith you can see all this and I don't have to edit it in later. Anyway, So what's the definition of classical conditioning? In classical conditioning, we've paired two stimuli such that one comes to stand for the other as evidenced by a non-operant behavior. In this case, the two stimuli are the bell and the meat powder. And the bell has come to stand for the meat powder. In the minds of the dogs, the bell and the meat powder are the same thing. And how do we know that? Because we've measured a non-operant behavior, in this case, salivation, and the dogs salivate to the presentation of the bell as though we had presented food, even though we haven't presented food, okay? So hopefully that sentence makes more sense now. Classical conditioning pairs two stimuli, such that one comes to stand for the other as evidenced by a non-operant behavior, all right? Good. At this point, I'd usually ask for questions, but you're not here to ask them, so we'll just skip that part. What I want to get into next is this thing about chemical reactions in Greek and Latin and power structures. John B. Watson, what he wanted to be able to do was present all this stuff like a chemical reaction, right? He wanted to reduce behavior, human behavior, animal behavior, all behavior. He wanted to reduce it to chemical terms. Hang on a second. I don't know if you ever did stoichiometry in chemistry, right? And you'd start off by listing the ingredients: X ingredient, proportion, Y ingredient, proportion, arrow is the reaction, and then the result is the chemical compounds. And you have to math that out, and it's algebraic. That's what these guys want to do, man. They want to be able to state in chemical terms, if you have an organism and the stimuli in combination, what is the result? And they want to do it in the language of science and medicine, that obfuscating Greek and Latin that keeps the riffraff out, right? So now you have to come to them for training in the science so that you can learn to read the stuff that they're writing, power structures and empire building and all that stuff. So this is going to seem like jibber jabber and nonsense until we go through it, and it'll start to make sense. Hey, look, if it never makes any sense, I have color coded this stuff so that you don't really have to. It doesn't need to make sense. Just get through the mastery quizzes, pass a class. You can forget about it the rest of your life. Okay, good. So here's the terms, and they'll usually abbreviate these, right? So here's the terms up here: neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, and then right underneath that you have the NS, US, UR, CS, CR. That's just these same 5 things in that same order. They're abbreviating. There you go. So the neutral stimulus is the stimulus that's initially meaningless to the organism. So in the case of Pavlov and his dogs, that means we're talking about the bell or the tuning fork, right? Ring a bell in front of a dog, it really has no set pattern of responding to that. The most you're going to get is, right? It might be curious, but bells mean nothing to dogs. You have to condition, meaning they have to learn what bells mean. All right. So the next one is the unconditioned stimulus. And that means something that does have meaning to the organism. It might be inherent meaning, right? You're born knowing that bacon smells good and you salivate. Might be something that's trained, so later we can get into higher order conditioning, where you clap your hands and then you ring the bell and then you present the food. And the clapping hands, once you've conditioned the bell to stand for the food, you can clap your hands, ring the bell, dog will salivate, and then you can just clap your hands, and then the dog will salivate, right? Higher order. So the unconditioned stimulus means unconditioned for this phase of the training or the experiment. And then unconditioned response is the response to that stimulus that, again, you don't have to train right now, right? So you present a dog with food and the dog salivates, and you don't have to teach it to do that. It just does. So these two already go together, right? The unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, they're already paired. You don't have to pair those things. Good, fine. So this is going to be the bell, right? This is going to be the food. This is going to be salivating. And then the last two, if you see in color, you'll notice I've color coded them. If you don't see in color, you're going to have to like print this out and draw arrows on it to get your cheat sheet. But the conditioned stimulus is always the formerly neutral stimulus. That means that after you've repeatedly paired the bell with the food and gotten salivation, you can just present the bell now. The formerly neutral stimulus has become conditioned. The dog now does know what to do with a bell. You ring the bell and it knows that means food, and that gives you the conditioned response. You'll notice unconditioned response and conditioned response are both blue, because the conditioned response is always the formerly unconditioned response. You've just conditioned it now to happen in response to the formerly neutral stimulus, and you don't need that unconditioned stimulus anymore, right? So this is going to be the unconditioned response with salivating. The conditioned response, therefore, is also salivating. When you get good at these, you can do them in 5 words, right? So in the Pavlov experiment, you could just say bell, food, salivation, bell, salivation. 5 words, tells a story, everyone knows what that means. Okay, for the sake of more examples are always better. Let's go back to 1998. Like, all my problems for some reason stem from the mid to late 90s. Here we go. So it's 1998, and me and my new bride were driving across country in a U-Haul van with our car on a tow dolly, and all our crap is in the back there. You know what I mean? We're driving out from Boulder to Spokane, Washington. Of all places, Spokane, hecking Washington, right? And we need to stop somewhere outside of Bozeman, Montana, and we stop at this little one-horse town. Now, at that time, little towns were arranged, so there was a hotel at the coming in end and a hotel going out at the going out end, and they just expected people wandering through town, and you go in and you pay $32, get your room for the night, no ID checks, nothing like that. So that's just what we did, is we pick the hotel on the way in, and we go in, we get a room, but we also have to eat food. Now, 1998, I've only been in country for a few years, right? I'm not exactly fresh off the boat, but I'm fresh enough that when we find out the only restaurant in the whole town that's open is Kentucky Fried Chicken, I've never been there before. I've never been inside a Kentucky Fried Chicken. So this is where the classical conditioning story starts, right? The neutral stimulus in this case is going to be that KFC sign. I have no idea what's in there. It could be anything. It could be tasty fried chicken. It could be clowns juggling mice. It could be French people smoking cigarettes and saying how pointless life is. Literally anything could be inside that thing. I've never been in there. I have no idea, right? I'm like the dog when you ring the bell and it goes, huh? Right? Neutral stimulus, KFC sign. This is where the story gets complicated. Someone at the KFC that day didn't wash their hands before returning to work. You know what I mean? So me and the missus contracted a virulent case of the puke and shits. You can look that one up later. It's a medical term. We wound up spending an extra night at that hotel because we couldn't get more than 4 feet from a toilet. The unconditioned stimulus here is going to be E. coli bacteria. You do not have to train a human body what to do with E. coli. It already knows what to do with E. coli. It is to eject it from every available orifice at roughly the speed of sound. And that's the unconditioned response, right? That ejection, the puking, the throwing up, and the diarrhea. You don't have to train the body to do that. It gets E. coli. It just does that. So we're going to call this, for our purposes, though, that's going to be nausea, right? So the unconditioned stimulus is E. coli, the unconditioned response is nausea. Now it's been, how long ago was 98? Like 22 years or something, right? It's been 22 years, give or take. And it's still the case that if you bring in tasty fried chicken, but it's in that red and white box with the KFC logo, um, unfortunately, I know what's in that box. True or not, what I know is in that box is E. coli bacteria, right? And so I'm going to have a conditioned response to that, which is I'm going to feel a little grumbly in my tumbly and say, perhaps I won't, after all, eat the Kentucky Fried Chicken. Thank you. All right. So the story in 5 words here is going to be, what is it? Sign, E. coli, nausea, sign, nausea. Right? Get it? So I guess if you're not quite keeping up here, go back, run it through again. Ordinarily in a classroom, we do some group work at this point, and I'd have people come up with ideas of stuff that fits in here, and you're not here, so we can't do that. I'm just going to say, try and fit your own scenarios in here. See if you can get them in those 5 categories of things. See if you can narrow them down to 5 words. But the mistake that people usually make is you jump ahead to operant conditioning, right? You're trying to change someone's volitional behavior with rewards and punishments. That's operant conditioning. Keep that out of here. This stuff is all purely like visceral, reflexive, instinctive stuff. Let's say you're driving and you see the spinning red and blue lights behind you. And the first 5 times it happens, it's an ambulance or a fire truck, and you just get out of the way, nothing bad happens. So you have no particular feelings about spinning red or blue lights behind you. That's a neutral stimulus. But then one day you're going like 35 in a 25, you get pulled over, and Johnny T. Law like comes over and puts his face in your window and gives you a really hard time, wastes 45 minutes out of your day, embarrasses you, like everyone driving by is like, haha, sucker. So you're feeling all ashamed and guilty. All right. And you know what to do when someone gets in your face and give you a hard time. You have feelings about that, and those feelings might be anxiety, and maybe I could measure that with because of behavior. So they don't like anxiety as a behavior, but you can measure it with skin conductivity and blood pressure and pupil dilation. Let's just imagine you're driving around and I've got you hooked up to all that crap, right? Okay, cool. So the unconditioned stimulus here is harassment, and the unconditioned response is anxiety. But then you can condition that, and you can do it just in one thing, because things like fear and anxiety have survival value, just one try. And now every time you see spinners in your rearview mirror, right, that's a conditioned stimulus now, and the conditioned response is you're gonna feel that anxiety, and we could measure it on a skin conductivity meter, blood pressure, yada, yada, yada. Okay. So here it'd be what? It'd be spinners, harassment, anxiety, spinners, anxiety. Dig it? Yeah? Okay. Fabulous. So there, again, usually we'd have you go forth, map examples. Can't do that right now. All right. So we're going to move into the next part, and this is extinction. Extinction means reversing the conditioning. So we've conditioned you to respond in a given way to a stimulus, but maybe we don't want to leave you that way, right? So what's the fastest way to get there is just stop pairing the 2 stimuli, right? So Pavlov at this point has conditioned the dogs to salivate when they hear a bell, okay? So bell, food, salivate, bell, salivate. Now they salivate when they hear the sound of the bell or the tuning fork. How do I make them stop? Because I don't want the dogs always salivating every time they hear something like a bell and freaking out like it's dinner time, right? That's really annoying. Maybe your dogs are really annoying. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep ringing that bell all day long, you know, for like 3 or 4 days. Every 5 to 7 minutes, I'm going to come by and bam, slap that bunko bell. And then the dogs are going to go crazy and they're going to salivate and they're going to think they're getting fed, but they're not. They're not getting fed. And then I feed them at night, and I do it in the absence of the bell sound. And now I've detached the two stimuli, right? Food and bell have become detached, and eventually those will become detached in the minds of the dogs too. So that's fairly elementary. That's fairly simple. What we need to know about this is that different kinds of stimuli have different survival value. So it's relatively easy to pair stuff that's high survival value, and then quite difficult to unpair those associations once they're made. Okay? And it's relatively hard to pair stuff that has low or no survival value, and then easy to detach those in the future. So like food aversions, when I ask people to do examples, the top 5 examples are always food aversions. You know, you turn 21 and your friends took you out drinking because it's America, and you had too much vodka or something, and it went really badly, and there's throwing up in the back of taxi cabs and stuff. And so even to this day, the mere whiff of vodka is really disheartening, right? So food aversions, really, really easy to condition, really hard to get rid of. Sexual stuff. So I have a friend who, let's just say his first sexual experiences were in a janitor's closet. And so whenever he smells Pine Sol, he kind of gets going and he lets us all know about it. And it's gross and creepy, you know what I mean? Because it's really important. All of your ancestors who did not have sex are not your ancestors, right? So sex is really, really important for living species, including humans. So you can get all these paraphilias that are more or less weird and really difficult to get rid of once you have them, because it's just breeding's important evolutionary. Meanwhile, maybe there's stuff that doesn't have any survival value, and so it's really hard to get and really easy to get rid of. So I'm gonna well, first I need medical tubing and a little squeeze bulb, right? You know the ones? I'm gonna put the medical tubing on the squeeze bulb. I'm gonna put the end of the tube. I'm gonna get a volunteer and duct tape that like right next to their eye. Okay, and then so when I squeeze the bulb, the consequence is that air puffs out of the end of the tube. It puffs right in their eye, right? So squeeze, blink, squeeze, blink, squeeze, blink, squeeze, blink. And then I'm going to take my pen, I'm going to tap it, squeeze, puff, blink, right? Tap, puff, blink, tap, puff, blink, tap, puff, blink, tap, puff, blink, tap, no blink. Yeah, I didn't do it enough times. And if it was like KFC and E. coli, once would be enough because that has a ton of survival value, right? If you look at it this way, if you eat food and it turns out to be poison, and then you know you're one of our primitive ancestors, that small lemur-like monkey, you know, 8 million years ago, whatever, and you try some berries and the berries make you sick, and then you spend like 24 hours hiding out under a bush throwing up, and you have the puke and shit, so it's coming out both ends. And then, but you survive, right? It's a miracle, strong constitution, you survive. Well, you've been out of the breeding pool for 24 hours, haven't you? And you're more vulnerable. And you have to eat extra, and you have to catch up and drink a bunch of water, right? So you're out of the breeding pool potentially for like a week. And that's no good in evolution, to be out of the breeding pool for a period of time. It's a numbers game. You're not immediately ejected. But let's say that having eaten those berries and gotten sick and been out of the breeding pool, you're like, that was fun. I'm going to eat those berries again, right? Maybe it won't happen to me this time, or whatever. Well, every time you do that, you're decreasing your chances of successful breeding, right? So this is what we mean when we say it has evolutionary attachments or consequences. Some stuff just doesn't. It's just never been a thing in the environment where you hear a sound like someone tapping a pen on their desk and then air puffs in your eye and you have to blink. Like whether you do or don't really doesn't have any evolutionary import. And so it's really hard to condition it. I have to do it maybe 50 or even 60 times before I get tap, don't puff, blink. And then I can't really do it more than 3 times, you know? And then I go tap, no puff, blink, tap, half-hearted blink, tap, no blink, right? It's hard to condition. It's easy to extinguish or make extinct. It just doesn't have the survival value or the evolutionary salience, or like, pick the terminology that you want to use. Okay, so that's extinction. And then what do we get next? Read a little bit. I need to, oh, good heavens. I need to drink some tea. My mouth's getting dry. So that's Biobases. And then the so what question. So now that we know all this stuff, like, what can we do? Why bother teaching this to people? I mean, I've already told you that this stuff up here is like, come on, it's so useless. Unless you're a working behaviorist and like 9 people on earth use this stuff, unless you're using it every day, this is so useless. We just put it in college textbooks and torture students with it, you know what I mean? Why bother teaching all this stuff? Well, because the theory, even if you don't formally map it out that way, the theory does have uses. For example, I'm telling you these 3 things: advertising, drug treatments, treatments of phobias. Okay, so let's look first at maybe advertising. Sex sells. Why does sex sell? Because, again, all of your ancestors who didn't have sex aren't your ancestors, right? All of your ancestors back to the beginning of time found someone else to have sex with, and they cooperated and made babies, and that's how we get to be here. It's incredibly important. So now men's magazines are full of pictures of naked women. On the other hand, women's magazines are full of also pictures of naked women. Okay, it's really important for survival. Maybe not to you personally. I get it. Sit down, Derek. I understand. You're special. But for humans, sex is incredibly important, and particularly naked female bodies are very important. For males, they are desirable for that purpose, and for females, they are competition. They're competition. So either way, if I show people naked female, I'm not going to do it. Don't worry about it. Kids are safe in the room for now. If I show pictures of naked women, then everyone attends to those. In other words, they're stimulating, right? And I don't necessarily mean stimulating. Often that's the case, but not necessarily. I mean that your eyes open up to take in more light. Your brain chemistry changes a little. You put all your attention on that stimulus. Your heart goes just a little bit faster, you know? Okay. So what? Well, so that's it's a useful effect, right? If I can get basically everyone in the human population to attend to a particular kind of stimulus, that's a very useful thing to know, isn't it? So think of like Carl's Jr. ads. What's the connection between size 0 bikini models and giant hamburgers? No connection at all, right? If you go into Carl's Jr. and you look at who's sitting in there eating the hamburgers the size of their heads, it's not size 0 bikini models, honestly. It's dudes who look like me, right? Somewhat overweight, middle-aged people with no self-respect left. That's who's at Carl's Jr. eating those hamburgers. So you're absolutely not saying in those advertisements that you can eat that burger and look like that person. In fact, they're not saying anything. They're not saying anything at all. That's not the name of the game here. The name of the game is we're going to pair the Carl's Jr. logo, right? Carl's Jr. bikini model, Carl's Jr. bikini model, Carl's Jr. bikini model. And what's going to happen is over time, you're going to learn that when I show you the Carl's Jr. model, this really stimulating thing is about to happen. And so you see the Carl's Jr. logo, and automatically your eyes get a little bigger and your heart goes a little faster and your brain chemistry changes a little bit. A ton? No. This is stuff in the margins, okay? Again, it's a numbers game. It's happening in the margins. But how many fast food places do you drive by on your way home from work or school or wherever you go when you're not here? How many, honestly? Just between this office and my house, what do I go by? Definitely a Carl's Jr. There's a Sonic, a Burger King, a McDonald's, and those are just the on brand. There's a strip mall and there's a burger place in there with no name. There's Ford, Chinese, what do you call them? The buffet style. There's Taco Bell, Del Taco, Taco Cabana, Taco Star, El Rey de Taco, and another right next to the burger place in that strip mall, right? There's a faux place, there's a second faux place. Oh my God. So much fast food, right? So much fast food. So this is the attention economy. What they want is for you to pay slightly more attention to their logo than any of the other logos. Get it? So you're driving down the road and there's 90 fast food places that you could stop at if you're stopping at one today. And if they can get you to attend to the Carl's Jr. logo for 5 seconds more than that you attend to any of the other logos, they're winning. They're winning the numbers game. Does that mean every time you see it, you're going to stop there? Absolutely not. Absolutely, it doesn't mean that. But in the margins, the more we can associate like attractive naked people with given fast food logos, the more people are going to be swayed by their limbic system into stopping at this place instead of that place. All right. Who else is notorious for this? Beer. So what is the thing? Is it the whatever one is the silver bullet beer? I forget because I just don't care. Look, how many kinds of beer are there now at the liquor store? Obviously, if you're under 21, you have no idea, right? How many kinds of beer are at the liquor store? But if you're older than that, you know. This is what used to happen is military guys would come to Colorado Springs and they'd retire, and then they'd open volleyball courts for some reason. I don't know why. I was in the Air Force. I never played I don't understand, but that's what would happen. By the 90s, this is a retirement mecca, and people would come here and do volleyball. Okay, cool. What do they do now, though? Homebrew, right? Craft breweries evolve out of homebrew. So people retire from the military and they come here and they open craft breweries. How many? This is one of two epicenters of craft brewing in the U.S. The only place that's bigger is California, and that's because California is bigger. You know what I mean? So you go in the liquor store and you go through the beer, and there's 1,000. There used to be 6. Now there's 1,000 competing beer channels. You know. So beer has gotten very, very competitive, and they've always been completely willing to stoop to sex to sell beer. So the silver bullet commercial, whichever one that is, Coors or whatever. It starts out and there's like 2 schlubs at a bus stop, presumably waiting to go to work, you know, waiting on the bus to go to work. And behind them is like Pittsburgh or some place that's cold and gray and it's all concrete. It looks like a communist city that was built in 4 days, you know, those places in Russia. And so 2 schlubs and standing at the bus stop and just waiting. And then a third guy comes up and he's like, for some reason, he's pulling a cooler behind him. And he comes up to the bus stop and he opens the cooler and he takes out silver bullet beers. And then suddenly we're all day drinking at a bus stop in public on our way to work, whatever. And then a train flashes by and the scene changes while the silver bullet goes by. And now we're not at a bus stop waiting to go to work anymore because we drank the silver bullet beer. Instead, we're at a beach and there's girls in bikinis playing volleyball behind us, right? And that absolutely is 100% not what happens when you day drink at bus stops in Pittsburgh. You know what I mean? That is not going to be the outcome of that experiment. But that's not the point. The story doesn't make any sense. There is no story. That's not the point. The point is that when you see the women in the bikinis at the beach, everyone, males, females, gay people, straight people, everyone, your eyes get a little bit bigger and your heart goes a little faster and you fixate on that stimulus, whether you want to or not. Okay? So Coors Light, bikini girls, arousal, Coors Light, bikini girls, arousal, Coors Light, bikini girls, arousal, Coors Light, arousal. And you're in the liquor store and you spend half a second more looking at the Silver Bullet beer than at the other kinds of beer, start to win in the market. That's the point of that, right? So what else is there? Of course, yes, of course it's political. Of course it is, 100%. Like, who told the political operatives how to do this stuff and did not instill them with any of the ethics or morality about it? That it's so easy to get people to pay attention to their candidate and also fill them with disgust about another candidate. The modern feeling in electoral politics is not arousal at all. It's gross out. Why does negative advertising work? This is why. Why do they do it so much? Is that ethical, right? Is it okay to run like 96 congressional hearings about Hillary Clinton and Benghazi? What did they find in the 96th one that they didn't find in the 95th one? Nothing. Because that's not the point. The point is not a congressional investigation. It's to get those words paired in front of you in the media all day long. Clinton, Benghazi, Clinton, Benghazi, Clinton, Benghazi, Clinton, Benghazi. Does that change people's voting behavior? Yes. Not every individual, of course not, but just enough to sway an election? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, it does. And to be fair, Trump, Russia, Trump, Russia, Trump, Russia, all day long. Now, one team's better about their messaging than another. Yeah, okay. But the same thing, everyone does it. Is that okay? Is that okay with you that we hijack your limbic system to impact your behavior? Well, we teach these classes as though there are no ethics attached, and there are ethics attached. There are ethics attached. When we get to the end of the next lecture on behaviorism, I'm going to hit you pretty hard on the ethics of psychology. Like, you shouldn't just go changing the way people think about things using conditioning. The more that you have power, the more that you're responsible to stay your hand. Okay. Good. So next thing, I mean, psychology is mostly, the purpose of it is to help people. Okay. So how could I use this stuff to help people instead of just selling them products and making profits or grabbing power? Well, what about people with addictions? Where do cravings come from? One patient, he was an alcoholic, a self-described alcoholic, and he had a really clear setting. What would happen is he'd go to baseball games, and at baseball games, whenever the guy comes around with the beers, he'd drop $9 and have a beer, but by the end of the thing, he finds that he's dropped like $45 and had 5 beers, and he's really drunk. When he can't go to the game, he puts on the TV and does what? Drink beer. And his friends talk to him about baseball, and he gets a craving, and he drinks beer, and he's like, how can I go to baseball games and not drink? It's starting to cause problems. It's making me sick. I'm gaining weight. My liver's in bad shape. I don't have money. It's wrecking my relationships. No one wants to go to games with me because I get drunk and outrageous. And sorry, the answer is stop going to baseball games. If you associate baseball with beer every time you think about, hear about, see, discuss baseball, and you're drinking, we need to cut baseball out of your life. And then we can start to do solid work on, maybe you don't want to be abstinent, maybe you want to do harm reduction. I'm with you. Never going to work as long as baseball's in your life. Step up. Maybe people with heroin addictions, like the first step in their cure is an entire change of scene, man. Because all the places that you go remind you of heroin, and you get the craving, and all the people you see in those places give you the craving. And the only sane, rational thing to do is move, get away from all the people and all the places, and then work on recovery. Maybe you can come back in 5 years. Maybe you can. But right now, right, you need to GTFO, as the kids said 5 years ago, right? So Definitely we can use this logic of extinction working on on addictions and cravings. Absolutely, that matters. Change the scene, change your relationships, change your places. So there's that. What else? You probably saw on the list. So the last thing we're going to do is phobias. All right. So we need to talk about phobias. And the first question obviously is, well, what is a phobia anyway? If I ask a room full of people, which I don't have right now, the first answer is going to be, it's an irrational fear of something. Yeah, okay. You're half right. The fear, though, might not be irrational, right? It might make sense to be afraid of certain kinds of things, and that's why we're predisposed to. It's the level of fear that's irrational. Does it make sense to be afraid of spiders? From an Evo perspective, absolutely it does. Why? Spiders can bite you, and they're venomous, so you'll get sick, and almost no spider will bite you and you'll die, right? Maybe if you're allergic and you have an anaphylactic shock, that's so rare. But some of them can necrotize tissue, and it can be really inconvenient, and maybe you're sick for a while, and so for the time that you're sick, you're out of the gene pool. So again, it's a numbers game, and it makes a certain amount of sense to avoid stuff that temporarily reduces your chances of breeding. Right? Get it? Cool. Snakes. Does it make sense to be afraid of snakes? Yeah. I mean, maybe you're a herpetologist and you can tell which ones are deadly venomous and which ones aren't. But if you can't tell, then it totally makes sense to give all snakes kind of a wide berth, treat them respectfully, give them distance and room. Yeah, because you go messing with snakes and they bite you and you could die. There's no modern medicine 10,000 years ago. Shoot, there's no modern medicine in Kentucky, okay? Doctors Without Borders used to operate in so-called third world countries, but now they do most of their work here because we're too poor to afford best healthcare in the world for rich people. Don't have it. It makes sense to avoid snakes, right? Because you could get sick and die, or you could get sick and be inconvenienced either way, but you don't know which is going to happen. So there's these classes of things that it does actually make sense to be afraid of. Spiders, snakes, heights, fires, clowns, and John Wayne Gacy, right? It makes sense to be afraid of clowns. So I could ask around the imaginary room, like how many people have arachnophobia, and someone's going to raise their hand. But if you're in my classroom, you almost certainly do not have arachnophobia. Okay, in order to diagnose it, clinically speaking, then it has to cause clinically significant distress or impairment. That means that in one of three realms, it needs to be causing you some dysfunction. You can't go to school because you're so afraid that there might be a spider at school, right? That you're just terrified to go there and you'd rather stay home. You can't drive to work because you're terrified that a black widow might have laid eggs in your ventilation system, and while you're driving, they'll boil out and a million black widows will crawl up your nose and you'll die, It's not doing that. It's not doing that. You're probably just dramatic, okay? You see a spider, you overreact, you get attention, whatever. That is not arachnophobia. It's not causing clinically significant distress or impairment. You're out. And if you're at school, you probably don't have major phobias the way we describe them in the literature, okay? So that guy. But it does make sense to be afraid of certain classes of things, really dangerous things, and but it's the degree of fear causing, again, you can't go to work or school, you have an ophidiophobia, you're terrified of snakes. Everyone, unless they're a herpetologist, basically everyone's kind of scared of snakes. But you're so afraid of snakes that you collect your urine and feces in plastic jugs because you can't sit on the toilet for fear that like a snake's going to come up through the pipes and bite you in delicate, tender regions. Okay, now you have ophidiophobia. Granted, the degree of fear, it's impacting your behavior, and that doesn't make sense. Okay, that's a phobia. So how can we use this knowledge to treat a phobia? Well, let's get back into how behaviorists think we get reactions. You pair two stimuli, and the two stimuli, one stands for the other, and we can measure that because it causes the same non-operant behavior. In this case, terror. We could measure that, couldn't we? The person staying home all the time, they're terrified. Okay, skin conductivity, sweat, whatever. Right? We can measure terror. So if that's how you got it, then the way that you'd fix it would be extinction, right? You'd use extinction to get people over their phobias when their phobias are causing clinically significant distress or impairment. How? Number one, you could do flooding. As a young Jason, maybe I'm 9 or 10 years old, I was afraid to go into the swimming pool, and then a neighbor one day grabs me and picks me up and physically throws me into their backyard swimming pool. And then I had to figure it out, right? I eventually learned. It took a minute, but I got myself under control and sort of dog paddled and struggled to the edge. Like, oh, that's not so bad. Right? There could have been a radically different outcome, though, couldn't there? We don't use flooding for reasons, for fear of those maybe bad outcomes. So let's say you have an ophidiophobia, and your family stages an intervention. You have a rich family, and they stage an intervention. So you're getting home from work, wherever you go during the day, you're getting home, and you pull up, and you see Joe Rogan is like leaning by your mailbox, looking all innocent and stuff. And you go to check your mail, and you're like, "Hey, aren't you Joe Rogan though?" And he goes, "Yeah, I am Joe Rogan," because that's how he talks. "Yeah, I am Joe Rogan." And he reaches in his pocket and comes out with chloroform, right? And the next thing you know, you're waking up at his warehouse. And I guess the first lesson is avoid Joe Rogan, but we'll get to that. So you wake up in a glass coffin, and you can see all around you, but you can't really move. And you wake up, and Joe Rogan is like bolting down the last screw in the glass coffin, and what's happening? And he goes, "Oh, hey, aren't you had enough of phobia?" Right? And there's a little hole in the thing, and as soon as you're awake, he starts feeding snakes through a little hole in the top of the glass coffin. And now you're laying in the coffin, and the coffin's filling up with snakes. They're non-venomous snakes, but you don't know that. And you're terrified. There's no escape. You're forced into the confrontation with the aversive stimulus, in this case, we're going to call it. The thing starts to fill up with snakes, and you're screaming and maybe making some snake jelly. So PETA's not very happy, you know what I mean? And but there's nowhere to go. So eventually you become exhausted. Fear, terror in particular, is a high energy state, and it uses up all your energy. You just can't maintain a high energy state for very long. Within an hour, maybe 2 hours, if you're fit and healthy, you're exhausted. You've screamed all you can scream, and nothing's happened. And your heart's been pounding and pounding and pounding. There's nowhere to go and nothing to do, and you've used up all of your available blood glucose, and so you crash. But the post-terror crash feels like euphoria. All right. So what's happening? You're in a container full of snakes, and there's no escape. But actually, nothing bad's happening in there. It's just you and the snakes, and they're not biting you, and it's fine, actually. And you have this sense of that rebound from terror, which feels a little bit euphoric. So you're floating in your snake jelly, feeling a little bit of euphoria, and you're calm and peaceful. And we could totally cure your phobia in one setting through this flooding. Great. Why won't we do it? Because what else could happen? What else could happen? Right? You could have a heart attack. If I push you in a room full of clowns and shut the door, right, I have to pay for the dental work on those clowns, and dental work, this is America. Dental work costs money. It's very expensive. We could do higher order conditioning, man. Instead of leaving without a fear of snakes, maybe you leave with additional phobias, right, of glass coffins and Joe Rogan. And honestly, if you see Joe Rogan coming, you should have work to do in a different direction, right? You know what I mean? That should already be in your, but if it's not, we could create that, and maybe it'd be problematic, right? Flooding can be can be quite dangerous and quite risky. And so unless it's an emergency, we have to do it right away. Not going to do it. So what do we use instead? Incremental exposure. So maybe you don't have a phytophobia, you have a clown phobia, right? And so the first piece of information that you need is that there exists a Facebook for clowns. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, isn't Facebook just full of clowns? Well, yeah, but I mean a specific book. It's a copyright book. And if you are a clown, you have to register your face paint as a trademark, right? So you have to take like that passport photo and give them your name and register it in the book of clown faces. So there's whole books, just copyright books full of faces and names and numbers, whatever, for clowns. Are you going to sleep better tonight knowing that information? I hope so. So you're going to come in the office, and we're going to find out what's your anxiety level with clowns, 0 to 10, right? And we want to keep your anxiety under a 3. So a 1 or a 2 is fine. We get over 3, and I'm going to teach you a bunch of coping skills day 1, breathing exercises and distraction and stuff to bring your anxiety down. So if it's 1 or a 2, it's fine. It's over that, we're doing our exercises, getting it under, okay? So day 2 comes in, and we're just going to talk about clowns. And the mere mention of clowns brings your anxiety up, and on your subjective scale, it's like a 5 or something. So we do your exercise, and we get it down to a 1 or a 2. When it's a 1 or a 2, we can talk about clowns. Within 1 day, really, we should be able to talk about clowns without your anxiety escalating past that. Maybe it takes 2. Really, this is a 10-session cure. So we're in a hurry. Usually I can do it in a day or 2. The next session, right, when you can talk about clowns and your anxiety stays low, then we're going to look at pictures of clowns. We're going to get on the clown Facebook, right? And when you can look at pictures of clowns and stay under a 1 or a 2, we're going to watch movies about clowns, not killer clowns from outer space. You almost have to go back to the 50s to find movies about clowns where nobody gets murdered, but you can do it. They exist, okay? And when you can watch movies about clowns, right, we move to the next most realistic thing, which is your graduation session, right? And on graduation day, in the office next to my office, I brought a clown in full makeup, and they're sitting in there waiting. We manage your anxiety. We go over there. We step in the doorway, You look at them and make eye contact, and we manage your anxiety. Then you sit across from them, and we get your anxiety under a 1 or a 2, right? And then you stand up and shake their hand and introduce yourself. And by the time we leave, you're like best friends with Clowny McClownerson or whatever. And you graduate and you're done. And that's it. Right? That's called incremental exposure. And it's a way to use extinction to help real people with real actual problems. Okay. So I'm sure I'm over time. And with no one here to keep me on time, I'm just going to keep going. Watch the rest, don't watch the rest, but we're done with the conditioning part of the lecture. So I'm saying goodbye to a bunch of people. But I'm an existentialist, so I always want to take the chance and throw some existentialism into this stuff. Like, are the conditioning people correct that that's the only way to get a phobia? Because if that's the only way to get a phobia, then it would make sense to say that's the only way to treat a phobia, right? What if it's not? What if there's another way to get a phobia? So the early existentialists are going to say, obviously not. Obviously, people walk around afraid of stuff all the time. And here we go. I'm looking for a book right now. The computer's on my bookshelf, so I'm looking for a book. So this guy is Ernest Becker, right? The book is The Denial of Death, okay? And what Becker is suggesting is that people are the only species really consciously aware of the fact that they must die one day, right? It occurs to you at some point, maybe in childhood, you lose a grandparent and you go to the funeral and everyone's hush-hush about it. They make it really scary. You start to become aware of the fact that everyone must die. And that's inescapable. It's one of the 4 givens of existence, as Yalom would say. Death comes for everyone. You can't escape it. That's going to happen. But you can't walk around just scared all the time that you might die. You'd be really dysfunctional. You know, you have to take chances and live your life and fall in love and procreate and eat hamburgers and cope with coronavirus. You know, you can't just have death salience in your face all the time. So one way to cope with the omnipresence of death and death salience and the anxiety that follows is to forget about it. Right. So you start to, as the early Freudians would have said, you know, you just suppress your knowledge of death so you can get on with your life, and that's functional. It's just that sometimes that anxiety dogs you. But since you've repressed or suppressed the death knowledge, you have that anxiety and like no explanation for that anxiety. So you might take it and logically, because you've forgotten about death, you put it on things in the environment. Ideally controllable things, you know? So instead of just being afraid of death and knowing that you have to manage the fact that you're going to die, you become afraid of spiders. You see a spider in the presence of your death anxiety, and down deep in your brainstem it goes, wait, that makes sense though. That makes sense. And like, you can more or less control your exposure to spiders. We mostly don't go around seeing spiders all the time, every day, everywhere, right? And when you see one, you can crush it, vacuum it up with the vacuum cleaner, get your kids to take it outside, whatever, right? So now that anxiety you always feel, you can put on a relatively controllable thing in the environment. The more controllable, the better. Like snakes, you can avoid. And you can blame your anxiety on the possible snake exposure and foreigners and viruses and all that stuff, you know. Actually, compared to death, which is completely uncontrollable, that stuff is relatively controllable. Is that a good way to handle it? I mean, compared to what? But now you have this phobia and you need to manage it because it's getting out of hand. You know, you're that person who can't drive to work in the morning for fear of snakes and the ventilator or whatever thing is the scenario. We need to make it go away. So you go to a CBT person, and the CBT person does this incremental exposure and they make the snake phobia go away. Okay, cool. It works. It's just that you're still afraid of dying and you still have that ever-present anxiety, but we've taken away snakes as the excuse to feel the anxiety. So I see you again in 6 months or something, and now it's a spider phobia. So we repeat the treatment, but with spiders, and then you go away, and you know, Rosie, the rose-haired tarantula, crawls on your hand, and you whatever, it's fine, and you're cured. Cool. But you come back in 6 months or a year, and now it's clowns or the French or something. You know, it's not working. It's not working. It's not working because you didn't get the phobia by a simple association. You know, the clown came to your birthday party and your dad hit your mom, and now you always associate clowns with. But we do the thing in the incremental exposure and it goes away. No, it's not how you got the phobia. You got the phobia by always being afraid that you'll die. When you're afraid of spiders, right? What are you actually afraid of? Exactly. You're afraid the spider will bite you and you will literally die. You're afraid of snakes. What are you actually afraid of? That's right, that they'll bite you and you'll die. Clowns. What are you actually afraid of? John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy. Look it up. If you don't get that, look it up, okay? Just take a second right now. I'll wait. I'll sip tea. Look it up. All right, John Wayne Gacy, get it? Okay. So how can I help you? Well, I have to go now directly at your real phobia, which is death. What you're really actually afraid of to the point of dysfunction is dying, okay? So the existential treatment is going to go 2 directions. Probably first, we need to work on your terror of ambiguity, right? People see things in a really bipolar, black and white sort of fashion. The world just isn't actually like that. So we need to open you up to ambiguity a little bit. So maybe we want to think about the universe. How big is the universe? Well, it's infinitely big. Yeah, but that didn't mean anything to me. I have no experience of infinity, you know. It's infinitely big and also infinitely small. Wait, what are you talking about? Those are opposites. That can't be true. But it can, you know. Every time we look for a smaller thing, we find it, you know. By 1900, we were sure the smallest thing in the universe was elements, atoms. An atom is the smallest indivisible thing in the universe, and everything's made of these atoms in different combinations. Wait, but that's crap, right? Because along comes Einstein, and bam, now we're karate chopping atoms in half. And there's stuff in there that they're made of protons, and no, they're made of positrons and neutrons and electrons, right? They don't take up any space, but you can also wham karate chop those in half, and there's stuff inside of those, and they're made of smaller things, neutrinos and quarks and muons and gluons and whatever stuff's in there. And what's inside that? Presumably something else. The universe is infinitely small. It doesn't even make sense to talk about how small things are. You know, the constituent elements of matter, down to being left of quivering strings of energy. How does energy quiver? What are you even talking about? What are you even talking about? And every time we look for something bigger, we also find that, you know. The solar system is all that there is, and stars are pinpricks in the night sky. No, they're not. As late as 1968, we thought the Milky Way was the Milky Way galaxy was the entire sum of existence. And then that turned out to be crap. We start, where radios are everywhere and we're detecting cosmic background radiation, and it proves that, in fact, the Milky Way galaxy, some 200 billion stars, is just one of 200 billion galaxies, each made of an average of 100 billion stars. And that number's changed over time. And we look for bigger stuff and we find that too, cosmic background radiation and gravitic filaments. Why, after the Big Bang, did stuff even begin to cohere? Why did it clump? Why was there not an even distribution of stuff? Well, the gravitic filaments, cosmic background fluctuations in gravity, tiny, millions of decimal places out fluctuations in gravity, but they cause very slowly things to begin to clump and cohere and form the matter that we know of. And why would we think that those are the biggest structures? So now cosmologists think that the universe as we conceptualize it is just a bubble in a vast sea of foam, of bubbles that grow and collapse and burst and pop in and out of existence. And the background, all that stuff would be connected to, would be called the brane, B-R-A-N-E, sort of a play on membrane. And why would that be the biggest thing, right? Ambiguity. The universe is impossibly vast. You can't comprehend how vast it is, and impossibly tiny. You can't even begin to comprehend, like, vibrating energy. Matter vibrates energy. What are we even talking about right now? Well, that's ambiguity. Getting comfortable with ambiguity first. Because no one can tell you what's going to happen when you die, right? If someone's very, very certain about what happens when someone dies, they're wrong. They're just wrong about that. No one can tell you. So then we can work on your anxiety about death itself. When you can get comfortable with the fact that there are no answers, we can move on to death itself. Like, what's it like to die? People are afraid to die because it might hurt, but so what? Life hurts. Like, you're not capable of enduring pain. Of course you can endure pain. And then it's usually not as bad as you think it'll be, Drowning. Everyone's afraid of drowning. But the bad part about drowning is trying not to drown. The trying to hold your breath and the struggle and the terror. Once you're actually breathing the salt water, you're just respiring kind of normally. And people who have drowned and then been resuscitated report actually a feeling of calm sets in, and towards the end, even a bit of euphoria. It's just cold and a little uncomfortable, but the euphoria makes up for it. And it's not that bad a way to go. Being burned alive. Well, most people die of smoke inhalation first. They pass out in the first 3 minutes because There's no oxygen in the air. And even people conscious while they've burned, fire kills all the nerve endings in your skin. And so, yeah, it sucks for the first minute or 2 minutes. And then if you can navigate your way through the terror, you notice that your body's just gone cold and you're not really feeling anything anymore anyway. And so there's ways to go. It's one of the gnarlier, but even then, for a minute or two, it's gnarly. But when has your life not been gnarly? Come on. Right? So people, we can get them over the fear of the process of death by explaining that, dwelling in it, looking at it, that same incremental exposure. But then the idea of dying meaninglessly, right? So I can have you plan your funeral and write you start small, write your epitaph, what words will be on your tombstone, and are you satisfied with that? And write your eulogy and who's going to deliver it, and just start getting comfortable with the fact that you won't be around anymore. And with this work, we can. I'm not going to make anyone eager to die. That's not the point. And of course, you're still going to have respect for it. Like, I get you over your snake phobia, and you don't become a snake handler. Same with death. You're not eager to go, but you know that it's going to happen, and it doesn't occupy all of your attention. Now you can function normally. But now these other phobias you've been presenting with, like, what would be the point of those? Now you go away and you never come back, because if you're not afraid to die, why would you be afraid of spiders or snakes or heights or fires or open spaces or clowns? So that's kind of the existential answer to all this behaviorism stuff. The behaviorism side, is it good and useful and fruitful and true? Yeah, absolutely. Almost all the time, like 9 times out of 10, that person goes away and never comes back. But that 10th time out of 10, that's when we need deeper reflection on what does all this stuff actually mean. So I haven't been watching the time. I assume we're way over. Thank you for joining me for this thingy, and gonna let you go have your real life. Okay. Okay. Bye.